Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another edition of CPA Presents. My name is Mike Kasalniak. I am the Flight Safety Chair for the Colorado Pilots Association. Tonight's guest speaker is Mr. Dan Millican. Dan is a filmmaker, television showrunner, owner of a production company, a pilot, CFI, and Dan has won over 40 industry awards for his work in film, TV, commercials, and corporate video. And most recently has created the YouTube aviation channel Taking Off and another one called In the Hangar. Born and raised in Austin, Texas, Dan's creative passions was established at an early age, writing screenplays in school, banging them out on old typewriters. During his career, he has written and directed 5 feature films with actors Adam Baldwin, Diamond Phillips, Patrick Flannery, Mimi Rogers, and many others. On the small screen, Dan has directed and produced many television shows, most recently the reality series Cowgirls for RideTV and Road to Glasgow for EarthX TV. Dan became a pilot in 2015 in order to fly drones legally for his production company. He immediately took to the skies and continued his training, achieving his instructor rating in 2019. With all the travel he has been doing for filming, he purchased a 6-seater Cessna 210 and hauls the crew and gear all over the country for shoots. After becoming a pilot, Dan combined his 2 passions, filmmaking and aviation, to create the Taking Off channel, which currently has over 55,000 followers. His production company, Serendipitous Films, is a script-to-screen machine that keeps small yet delivering big house production quality. Among his strengths are resourcefulness to produce high value on sometimes limited budgets, as well as his people skills working with both professional and non-professional talent. Once again, Dan, thank you very much for coming on board and doing a presentation here for the Colorado Pilots Association. We really appreciate it, and I'll turn it over to you, sir.
All righty. Thank you very much, Mike. And by the way, Christy Wong has joined us. So Christy, why don't you unmute and say hi to everybody? Christy is my co-host on the Taking Off channel. So you guys have seen her quite a bit there.
Hey, hi everybody.
Hello. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So the topic of today, and Christy, feel free to jump in at any point. We're going to talk about investigations and how they can make us better pilots and better people. For our channel, for Taking Off, really that's our mission statement. Content so that the viewer can walk away to be a better pilot or a better person. And with that, we're going to cover some of the accident reporting. That'll make you hopefully a better pilot. We're going to talk about investigative journalism best practices so you can kind of see what's going on in social media. Aviation is kind of become a dumpster fire to some degree. We're going to talk about that a little bit. And we're going to get to kind of what I feel like is the root of some of the biggest problems here, which is my takeaway with a lot of the accidents. And then I'd like to open it up for a lot of Q&A. So you heard a little bit about me. I love puzzles. And so accidents are kind of like that for me, which hits the curiosity that we'll talk about in a minute. Christy and I both, long before we were pilots, had separately, we didn't know each other, but I have books and books of black box transcripts and things like that, because I was very intrigued, even as a non-pilot, about accidents. And Christy was too. And the rest of this stuff on my background, you guys already know, so we're going to move on. All right. By the way, picture there is, I don't know if you know, it's the anniversary of PSA 182, which was the crash, San Diego, wasn't it, Christy?
Yeah. So, and funny enough, this was one of the very first accidents that I ever looked into. I was really interested in flying at an early age. And in the early 2000s, when like Google was just becoming a thing, I remember one of the first things, I know this sounds so morbid, I was so curious about black box recordings and what was going on inside the flight deck during those last moments. Like what happened with those pilots? What did they do? What could I learn from it? It's very morbid, but it's the truth.
Which does bring us to the psychology behind accidents, investigations, and all that kind of stuff. And we're going to hear a lot about psychology tonight, probably more than you thought we were going to. So as Christy mentioned, she had a morbid curiosity, and there's a lot of reasons why people will start looking at accidents and start investigating them. Also, empathy, meaning, you know, I really care about the other person that was impacted by the accident. Comparison is for, you know, what that could have been me. And we want to know more because, wow, what if that had been me? Of course, sensationalism, you know, everybody loves watching the races for the car wrecks. And, you know, when you look at social media today, the biggest YouTube videos are fails and crashes and all this kind of stuff, and TikTok especially. A lot of sensationalism going on out there. And lastly, coping, because we want to know what happened in the accident so that we can kind of cope with our own fallibility, our own, you know, but for the grace of God, there go I. I mean, we could easily have been that pilot or that person or whatever. So diving into the accidents is a good way to cope with our own questions. So I don't know if you guys recognize the photo on the left, but I want to talk about best practices, and I'll get to the photo in just a moment. But in investigative journalism, you know, there's actually degrees for this, and I know it doesn't seem like that today, but in the olden days, there were quite a few. There was a lot of ethics. There was a lot of integrity. I'm not saying it was full of everybody who had integrity, but Walter Cronkite, all those guys were very well respected. And it's not because they were 100% objective. Nobody, I don't think, can ever be 100% objective, but they had a firm belief in ethics and a way of doing things, the best practices. And I've talked to a YouTuber who does accident investigations recently. It's not who you think it is. And they had not done, they're wondering why they got a lot of blowback from comments and stuff, because they normally don't. And he called me because of that. And I said, well, you didn't really do any research on this. And he got kind of offended. I said, well, look, would you go onto a plane as a passenger where you know the pilots don't do the best practices of being a pilot? And he goes, no. And I said, well, there are best practices for investigative journalism, and you didn't do them here. And at the end of the conversation, I think he started to get it. But there are best practices. You don't take a position at the outset of an investigation. You look at all the evidence, you research, you do the work. You don't trust, but you do verify, and you get multiple sources. You do the work to be able to draw conclusions. You've got to have a really good picture. Look, I'm real impulsive in life, and I'm a pretty good chess player, but what would do me in was my impulsivity. And I would just real quick make a move without looking at everything around the board, because, hey, I just knew that this is what was going to work. And that does not lend itself well to investigative journalism. Okay, so that picture on the left is the head of the American Airlines Flight 191 in Chicago, the head of the NTSB investigation. Just that picture is like, I don't know, a day or two, maybe 3 days after the accident. And the NTSB is getting up there and they're saying, we have the culprit right here. And so for all those that complain about the NTSB taking a year or whatever to get the story when it might be obvious, this is one reason why it's important to do the study, to do the work, to do the research, and not just to look for the quick answer, because that was not the culprit in American Airlines 191. That was just a byproduct of the culprit, but they were looking for a quick answer. They did not take a position. They did not take an objective position at the outset. So you have to do it. Now, that's investigative journalism. Now let's talk about news, because it's different than investigation. And I'll get on my channel, I'll get some flack occasionally when I report, there were two T6s that had a mid-air collision at Reno. And people don't get, I get very little flack, especially compared to others, but all I'm doing is reporting the news. That's different than an investigation. But if I'm reporting news, I cannot speculate. I cannot draw conclusions, and I should always try to get a second source. Otherwise, you're going to be in error, and errors are just are not good. And having done news stories where I was in error makes me all the more want to really verify before I put something out there. In accident investigations, it's even more critical, because if I come out with an error in an accident investigation video, it hurts people. It damages people's lives. And so it's so important for those who practice investigative journalism to get it right, to strive to get it right. It doesn't mean you always will, but it's important to go through the best practices. So,
well, there was that one time, Dan, remember? I think it was in like 2019 or 2020. It was when we were first starting to do those news reports. And it was a while back, but there was one in particular that you and I threw together. We were like, we need to film this. I was in the studio that day. I filmed it, we put it out, and it turns out we had some wrong information. So it was me doing it. And so that goes on me. It goes on the channel, but it goes on me. I felt so bad.
It was that specific instance that really drilled home to me that I got to remember journalistic best practices for news and make sure that I verify.
Right.
You're absolutely
we came out though, like I think our very next story or something, we came out with like a revision. We apologized for the error previously. I remember that being a big deal for me. I was like, no, we have to say something, because it just didn't settle well with me.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and that's why you see newspapers with retractions and everything else. It's, you never get 100% of people who watched your incorrect news story who will read your retraction. So you've got to strive to get it right the first time. So, all right. So that's a big difference between news and investigation. So now, the whole point of this one is, what I've learned, what we can take away from accident investigation. Again, differentiating, this is not news. I'm not talking about news. I'm talking about investigation. So these are the videos, like we did a video on American Airlines Flight 191. Chrissy's video on John Denver's one of our most popular videos on the channel. We've got Randy Rhoads, the famous guitarist for Ozzy Osbourne, who died in a Bonanza VTOL. Patsy Cline, the list goes on. These are accident investigations that we've studied. And so I really kind of want to separate, though, two things: 121 world and 91 world. So GA and airliners. It's the airliners, the accidents are, the causes can be very, very complex, and you can take away from them quite a few lessons. In this one, American Airlines 191, it's about maintenance and the importance of having consistent maintenance and not having a second crew come in without proper communication and all that. For PSA 182, it's about identifying traffic and looking at it, and also the creation of the Bravo because of PSA 182. And I want to separate that 121 stuff. And now let's talk just GA 91 accident investigation, which I've done some of that as well. I don't do as much of that because it tends to be one note for what we can take away to make us better pilots and better people. And the one note is fly it all the way to the crash site. Most of the 91 fatalities that I'm seeing, engine outs or loss of thrust on takeoff or whatever it is because the pilot is stalling the plane. I mean, that's the number one thing that I'm taking away out of this, is fly it all the way to the crash site. And if there was one thing you could take away, that's what I would. For me, the other things I've pulled away from this is, if for anybody who's watched my channel, you've heard me say superior judgment trumps superior skills. I don't say that to you guys. I say it to remind me. Like, I actually even have a challenge coin that I had made, and I keep this in my pocket. And around the edges, it says superior judgment trumps superior skills. And I feel that in my pocket all the time, because I have a tendency to go, oh, you know what? I'll make this bad judgment because I'm a hot shot pilot. I can handle it. And that will get me killed. And the moment I kind of decided that's going to be my mantra was right after one of those times where I had people in my plane, and because of my poor judgment, it could have ended badly. I had to rely on skill when I shouldn't have. And so from then on, that's been my mantra. So lastly,
for the record, I am the exact opposite.
yes, yeah. So Christy does not have to worry about superior judgment, because that's always in her book.
I am superiorly cautious is what I am.
I'm the risk taker. And then the last thing is hazardous attitudes. And this is where this presentation is going to turn probably different than what you might expect. So with that, here we go. Heavy duty psychology. Yes, that's a Cirrus. I didn't know what picture I was going to put up there for hazardous attitudes, but I couldn't put like Christy. I couldn't put.
No, I was going to say you should have put the Bravo Buster on there.
Sure, I could have done that. Just attitudes. All you guys, this is all in your private. You all learn this, that the 5 recognized pilot hazardous attitudes: macho, impulsivity, resignation, invulnerability, and anti-authority. Where I want to go with these are just 3 of those 5. Okay. So I want to talk about the root of the problem here with 3 of these: macho, anti-authority, invulnerability, because I believe they're all rooted in narcissistic personality disorder. That's not just some kind of fun term or anything like that. It's a true psychological disorder that you can pull out of the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It is something that is diagnosed by psychologists, and it is a very complex mental condition. And the reason why I want to bring up NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, is because I believe it's epidemic right now amongst us. Not only pilots, but people overall. Yes, every politician will pretty much check the boxes on NPD, but a lot of pilots do too. And so this is my call out to hopefully some of you might hear it, because the NPD person doesn't want to change because, well, they don't. We'll get to that in a minute. But if we can address this and fix this in ourselves, it can make us a whole bunch better as a pilot and a person. And most people, not everyone, most people have narcissistic tendencies. So there is something here for everybody, even if you go, well, I'm not NPD, I give back to the community, I do whatever. Which, by the way, that is not a criteria for NPD. And because of that, let's get to that right now. So the criteria for the narcissistic personality disorder is very clear. This is all what's written out. This is what the psychologists look for. They look to see if you have grandiose ideas about everything, or about yourself, that you're the smartest person in the world, you're the most good looking, whatever it is. For some people, it might be smart. For others, it might be their athletic ability, whatever it is. Grandiose is one of the criteria. Another one is fantasies of success, and that's excessive fantasies of success. They're special. I'm special. I'm above the rules. These rules don't apply to me. And, that's real anti-authority right there. and requires excessive admiration for the narcissistic personality disorder, entitlement, sense of entitlement, exploitative. And this is an important one because it's going to mix something, and we're going to get to it in a minute. But exploitative, they manipulate others for their own gain. They lack empathy is a huge one. So you look at an NPD person, you go, how in the world can they do that to that person? Because they don't have any empathy. They don't feel that person. And they might be envious of other people's successes, arrogant, haughty. Those are the criteria that a psychologist uses to diagnose whether somebody has NPD or not. The prognosis, the outlook is not really good because, as I said earlier, the NPD does not really want to change. Hey, I'm above the rules. Why do I want to step down? I like where I'm at. But here's some interesting things. The NPD person will often mask low self-esteem, which leads to a hypersensitivity from any injury. And I put that in quotes because I know of one NPD person who had a perceived injury from me. And so they attacked me hard because they perceived an injury. And you just kind of have to laugh it off and just go, okay, well, this person's really, they've got a pretty bad mental disorder. An NPD person will have severe relationship impairment. If you're wondering if you have NPD, just look and see if you have any friends that have been around for decades. If you don't, maybe you do, because if you have a track record of burned relationships, there might not be just them, it might be you, as the song goes. So the end of the road for the NPD is a very lonely existence. A byproduct of NPD, going a step further in NPD. Erich Fromm was a very noted psychologist and escaped Nazi Germany and all that. And in 1962 or 64, he defined evil as malignant narcissism. So you take malignant, you take malice, you take that, what I mentioned, exploitative or exploitive element to NPD, and that's where you get evil. And if you're there, I hope you get help. But I bring all this up because I just want to, you're going to ask, well, what in the world does this have to do with what we're talking about, accident investigations? And I'm going to tie it together. So what do you do if it's, well, first you have to, is it you or is it someone else in your life that's NPD? Well, the treatment, the NPD person, the only way they're really going to seek help is if the pain of their NPD overcomes the payoff that they get from it. And so they have to get the pain. If you enable them to live in their NPD, then it's just going to take a lot longer. And this happens, you see it a lot with loved ones where they don't want to see them hurt. But that's actually the worst thing that you can do for the NPD. All right, then I told you we would relate this now to pilots. So with NPD, with narcissistic personality disorder or narcissistic tendencies, that is 3 of your 5 hazardous attitudes. That is macho. That is the anti-authority, and the other one, boy, I feel like Rick Perry there for a moment. But if you don't deal with this, you are probably going to fall prey to 3 of those 5 hazardous attitudes. Hazardous attitudes are hazardous because they can get you and other people killed. So probably a different take on accident investigations, but it's what I'm pulling from my own experience. I'm seeing this a lot, is these 3 hazardous attitudes. All right. So what you can do, the opposite of narcissism isn't just altruism, by the way. The opposite of narcissism is actually seeing yourself as you really are, self-aware, some people call it. I think Erich Fromm actually calls it objectivity. so you're able to see yourself objectively. Once you can do that, you can see that you're not the smartest person in the world. You're not above the rules. You're not all these different things. And once you can see that, it can help start to cure the NPD. You've got to develop empathy and get professional help. So that would be the things to do. And this is for you if you're NPD, or if you know somebody in your life who's NPD. Now, you cannot fix somebody in your life that's NPD. I'll just tell you that right now. They've got to decide to do it. If you try to help them, it'll be another burn relationship. So good luck. I know it's not easy. The whole reason why I've studied NPD is because I'm very aware of it in my own life. So, okay. So I'm going to in the structured part of this now, and I know it probably wasn't exactly what you were thinking would be where I was going to go with it, but hopefully it's something new and different that can make you not only a better pilot, but obviously a better person. Chris, do you have any thoughts on this?
It's something that you and I have talked fairly extensively about. And it does seem to be a trend in a lot of accidents when you start factoring in those hazardous attitudes. So it's something that even I've made myself aware of regarding hazardous attitudes, and just looking at the trends, even when flying with captains, like it's very relevant to me as a 121 pilot. When I get into the flight deck with a captain that I've never flown with before, and I see him displaying hazardous attitudes, I know that I need to mitigate that. Even if I don't feel like I'm displaying it, I know I need to mitigate it from my crew member. So it's relevant almost everywhere you go in this industry.
Exactly. And a lot of the early 121 crashes were all because of stuff like this. Look at Tenerife. Wow. That was, you talk about your NPD in the cockpit of the KLM. That's exactly why the worst aircraft accident ever happened was because of narcissistic personality disorder. Okay. So with that, I don't know, does anybody have any thoughts on that? And we can talk about this. We can talk about really anything, whether it's the Taking Off channel or anything else. But this is kind of what I just felt like I needed to share with you guys tonight.
Hey, Dan, this is Mike Kaselniak. I was taking some notes while you were talking, and one of the things that I've always seen, so to speak, fighter pilots, Top Gun aces, Type A personality. I've seen it firsthand. Would that rank up there with the NPD?
Absolutely. Well, and it's not that there's fighter pilots and there's NPD. It's just that, for us to be pilots to begin with, we've got to, we, boy, this is going to sound horrible. We are special, but we're certainly not above the rules. The problem is that the cream of the crop, to be able to become a fighter pilot, you have to in the military, you have to be in the very, very top of everything. And that lends itself to narcissistic personality disorder. Absolutely. And I would say that that's something fighter pilots would be really well served to remember. And it doesn't mean every fighter pilot. I've met a fighter pilot who is incredibly self-aware and is not NPD, and that's Richard McSpadden. Here's somebody who was an F-15 pilot, an F-16. He was Thunderbird 1. The guy is about as humble as you can get. So it doesn't mean every fighter pilot, but when you get to that level, yes, captain of an airliner, like Christy was talking about, any of these positions that take a lot of hard work, skill, and all this kind of stuff can lend itself to the narcissistic personality disorder.
Now, and I do want to point out too, there's Type A. I 100%, I put myself in the Type A category. I always excelled in academia and in pilot training and everything else. I wouldn't consider myself though NPD because I don't carry the traits.
No, no, and
You
you'd have
know,
that list. That criteria is very clear. And yeah, Chrissy, you're not NPD.
right. But I would say that a lot of accidents and incidents, when you kind of like, when they relate to the hazardous attitudes, obviously this does not include structural abnormalities and things like that. But I'm talking about the ones that relate direct, like Tenerife, that absolutely 100%. Like you look at Captain Van Zant, he was in PD, and you get into these situations with those individuals. So I just want to make sure that people know that there's a clear line between type A and NPD.
Yes, absolutely. It's a good point. Because yeah, most of us are probably on this call are type A.
Yeah, I agree with what you were talking about with ethics, news, and investigation. It really ranks me 100% when I see somebody get up there within 2 hours and say, well, it happened because of this, this, and that. And you're like, no, you're not going to know for 6 months to a year what really happened. And these talking heads get up there and spout off all this business, and it just rankles me to no end when they do stuff.
And some of you may wonder why we're seeing more and more of that. And I'll tell you just real easily why. First of all, it does feed the NPD ego. To be able to let me espouse to you what my opinion, which was really fact. Let me just tell you what the facts are, disguised as opinion. It feeds the ego, but not only that, it gets views. So going back to the human nature, one of the first list I had, why do people watch car wrecks and everything else? People are curious. People are sensationalists. People are all these things. So if you're trying to build a YouTube channel today, do accidents, and come out with your conclusions 2 hours after while the smoke is still burning.
While wearing a bikini too, I've learned. If you do that, like if you do the sensationalism with all of that, that'll really sell.
I'm so glad you're the one that offered that up, Christy.
Well, I mean, I've been trying to get Dan to wear a bikini. He just won't do it.
I think he's working on his tan first.
Yeah.
Well, a couple of years ago, and we had him on as a guest, last year, I believe, sometime. We had the NTSB do a presentation, and this gentleman was one of the investigators up in Alaska when they ran that TV show, I believe, on the Discovery Channel or the History Channel, where they followed the NTSB investigator into the field and through the crash site and all that kind of stuff. And I thought that was very, very interesting.
Well,
think about it with these air crash investigations, right? Like it's different when you're in an airliner or another, airplane that is required to have a CVR, cockpit voice recorder. A lot of times it's easier to get what's going on when you have all of that. But with GA accidents, you don't have any of that. So now you've got to look at everything, right? Everything from where was the airplane departing from, going to, what was the trajectory, the weather that day. I mean, there's a lot of math and science and just bootstrap groundwork going on, and it takes a long time. And I'll be honest, it really gets me too when individuals in particular get up and start spouting off speculation like they know everything. They made a few phone calls, they talked to a few eyewitnesses, maybe they're just making it up just to try to give themselves more, credibility to the masses. But either way, it hurts people. It hurts people and it hurts the process. It hurts the industry. And that to me is the most tragic thing of all, is that it takes what we do as pilots and it makes it like bottom feeder level. Ugh, I'm sorry. Thank you for listening to my TED Talk.
And that's what we're seeing. People are drawn to it, but it's bottom feeding kind of stuff. And it's driven by the NPDs with ego that is stroked by this kind of stuff. People with no empathy, people willing to come out and say, draw conclusions within 2 hours. And sometimes they're right. Sometimes they're wrong. And when they're wrong, it's devastating to the families involved. So,
right.
Other
When you
questions?
say, when you
Oh.
say get a second source, who's your go-to?
Well, on what? Are you talking about like an accident investigation? Or are you talking
Yeah.
about news?
Yeah, you had it under investigation. Don't speculate. Don't draw conclusions. Get a second source. Who would be your go-to?
So what I do when Chrissy and I approach doing a video, I'm thinking it like even just okay, I did a video on the Keith Green crash. That's a GA crash that happened in 1982. It took me a long time, but I went to the NTSB docket. And in the docket, you're going to have multiple different interviews of different parties. So you're going to get different sources right there. In addition, I pulled news stories from the time and things like that to compare that with what I was finding. And then on top of that, I interviewed myself people that were involved in that story. I called the only eyewitness in that crash. I called him myself to get not only just what was in the docket, but I wanted to hear it from him myself. So yeah, you look at every source you possibly can.
When I was doing John Denver, I went to the NTSB docket, of course. I knew nothing about this crash going into that story. It took me like 3 weeks of just like nonstop, all of my free time went into it because I actually got really interested in it once I started getting into it. But I wanted to make sure that what I was saying was correct, because the last thing I wanted to do was denigrate John Denver or his like family, his surviving like family members. I wanted to make sure that people knew why this happened, how they could prevent, something like this from happening in their aviation journey. But like, I didn't want to hurt him any more than obviously had already happened. So,
and the other really cool about the John Denver one for Christie's research was we had teased that we were going to be working on the John Denver months before we did it. I had the caretaker of the NTSB investigator reach out to me and sent me pictures from his file that I then sent to Christy. So we had some of the original notes from the NTSB investigator on that one.
Wow. Now that was an experimental he was flying, and from what I read, the fuel valve was behind his shoulder.
Yeah,
there
so
was a lot with that. So I mean, look, this is my shameless plug. You should watch the video because there's a lot of context.
Okay.
Because when you look at it, you're like, oh, okay, yeah, it was just, it was the valve or whatever. There were several reasons why this accident happened. That was just one, one slice of Swiss cheese, basically.
Yeah.
But you have to know, like, I actually start the video out like, why am I telling the history of John Denver just to talk about the crash? You have to know John Denver in order to know why this crash happened. His personality had everything to do with why this crash happened.
For those
which kind of goes full circle back into the whole like MPD thing and why crashes happen.
For those of you on the Zoom, I just put the link in chat for that particular presentation.
Brian.
Thank you, Brian.
Yep. Dan, one of the things that not just from a journalistic perspective, but as pilots, people get to know, oh, you're a pilot. And inevitably there's going to be an accident at some point in time in the community wherever you live. And just people will come over to you and say, hey, what do you think happened there? And I have a fairly common saying that it's like, look, I can speculate all day long, but if my butt's not in that seat making those decisions, it's a guess. And that's as close as I will come to offering up of exactly what happened. And I mean, to me, that's sort of a balance from my perspective.
Well, and for me, I'll have people ask me, and so then I'll start doing research, and so I can answer them based on what I might know. I usually won't answer them until after the NTSB prelim, but the prelim is usually 10 days, 2 weeks after the event, so it's pretty quick. But then you can also look up other stuff. So there is, for those who do the work of an investigative journalism, you call people, you talk to them, you know, like everybody's favorite punching bag, Trevor Jacob, you know, when it came out in March that he admits to pulling the stunt with the Taylorcraft, and that there was nothing wrong with it, blah, 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 and that he might do some jail time because of it. There was a press release that the California Federal District Attorney's Office put out, and most of the aviation YouTubers simply quoted from that press release. I called the press officer and talked to him for a while, and he actually sent me supporting documents from, like, he sent me the whole what do you call it, the not the confession, but whatever they had agreed on that Trevor Jacob signed and everything else, you know. So I got this 30-page document to go through and see exactly, you know, what it is that, you know, what he's admitting to and everything else. So if you do the work, you can actually, there's a lot of information out there. It's just in this day and age, people aren't doing the journalistic work on YouTube. They're not professional journalists and they're not following best practices, but they're chasing the views. And if you're the first one out there with some kind of an opinion disguised as fact, hey. Now one solution is for all of us to quit watching them, by the way. So if for all of you talking about, I don't like it when somebody's, you know, offers their opinion 2 hours after the crash, I hope you're not watching their channel anymore. So, I mean, that's really bottom line. Don't give them the views.
I've done that.
Robert, I'm not sure I can articulate your question well. If you'd like to unmute and chime in on that. Dan, Robert was one of our previous presenters.
Okay. So Robert's asking about like a culture of NPD at the FAA is what I'm thinking.
Right. Yes. I went as far as going all the way to FAA headquarters with a 30-second video that played for 2.5 days in FAA headquarters for an NTSB session on road safety, and they didn't want to kind of like that what I'd done with my computer was modeling a bunch of airplane crashes, obeying a regulation and disobeying a regulation. My computer model proved with peer review from NASA that if you obeyed the hemispherical cruising altitude regulations, you're going to be crashing 6 times more often than if you ignored them at random altitudes. And so my 30-second video showing in FAA headquarters ran for 2.5 days. And you'd have thought that something that close to home would have been noticed, that they could fix the technical error that I proved in my webinar for CPA in July, and proved with my 1997 research paper in risk analysis in International Journal.
Well, okay, to your question, could it be because of like an organizational NPD? I would say no. I think there's other reasons. I don't think an organization can be NPD. I think individuals are. But here's the crazy thing. The more a person suffers from NPD, the higher their level of NPD is, the less they're able to socially interact with others. So like having a corporate where everybody's NPD would be extremely rare and difficult and hard to see, because you get all these NPD people that everybody thinks they're above the rules. Everybody thinks they're special. Everybody thinks they're smarter than everybody else. And they would all kill each other. So I think that you might have one, or you might have, I mean, NPD is going to be everywhere. It's going to be at the FAA. It's going to be at, you know, Coca-Cola. It's going to be at Delta Airlines. It's going to be at anywhere. It's going to be at your home, you know, with maybe Aunt so-and-so or whatever. It's everywhere. But I don't think that you can have, my opinion, it's just my opinion, I don't think you can have an entity be NPD, if that makes sense.
That's that was the point of NASA's definition of a root cause. In the NASA definition for root cause, it's an organizational contributor to the accident.
Now, I would say absolutely there's organizational culture that can contribute to hazardous stuff. Absolutely. I'm saying organizational NPD, I don't think would be, I couldn't see that working.
Okay.
So I was thinking about this a little bit as flight instructors. I'm not a flight instructor, but when you're working with a student and you're identifying a hazardous attitude like that, how do you approach that? Do you have that conversation with the student? And because, you know, they might not be amenable to that type of feedback.
Oh, I can talk about that.
Okay.
I've actually, I have encountered that. So
you can't mention Brian though.
Yeah, no. Brian is like the opposite of NPD. He's actually, no, he's good. So I've got about 1,000 hours of dual instruction given, and I have encountered individuals before with that like NPD, like it's, you know, so like, or at least with NPD tendencies. What I do is so like, for example, I had a student in particular who refused to fly the airplane without the autopilot on. And I was like, this is for instrument training. I said, hey, dude, you're going to have to like demonstrate an approach, at least one approach, hand flown. You're going to have to hand fly the maneuvers, like the upset attitudes and stuff like that. And at any time, the examiner can say, hey, turn off the autopilot. I want to see you fly under the foggles, you know, so you need to be ready for that. So my approach was always to try to reason with the individual, present the facts, stay just logical and unemotional with them. But when I had situations occur where they weren't listening to me, they weren't following through, if you will. I mean, at the end of the day, I fired them as a student, and I fired 2 or 3 people as students. There was one time I couldn't really fire a student because I was working for the flight school and the students were assigned to me. I went to the flight school like manager and I said, look, this student is showing some really awful like characteristics. I mean, literally for me, it was all about documentation. Documentation will save your soul. I learned that in my prior career. So I started documenting all of the things that I saw. And what wound up happening with him, he wound up going out at night to do his like nighttime flying solo. And he literally crashed the airplane, you know, coming back into land, wrecked the airplane completely. And he wound up getting expelled from the school. But my conscience was clear because I documented everything. I saw the signs. So as a CFI, that's what I've done.
So we'll take it one step further then. What if it's not a student or somebody like that, but it's a pilot you occasionally fly with or around with?
Like a captain or something like that.
Oh yeah, I mean, that's even better, a better situation.
I did have a captain fairly recently. This was actually on 4th of July. I mean, it was so bad. This guy was so above it all, you know, like above everybody else. And what are you doing? Why are you doing it that way? And you're doing it wrong. I mean, he said these things to me, you know, in a very brisk and militant way. And honestly, for me, from now on, if I see his name, I'm not going to fly with him. I'm just going to avoid it. I have certain tactics, that I can use, but for most of them, if I see their name, I'm able to avoid it. There was another pilot in our area early on in my piloting career. I flew with him one time, and Dan, you would definitely know who this person is. Flew with this person one time and I was like, nope, I am not going to fly with them again because they displayed some very hazardous attitudes. And I've done that. I mean, I've actually flown with a few people like that where I fly with them and it just, something's not right there. And for me, I would much rather just avoid that situation altogether than put myself in a position where either A, my life is at stake or my certificates are at stake. It's not worth it.
And Brian, to put another illustration on it. So I knew of a guy that had one of the dysfunctional or hazardous attitudes, anti-authority. And I confronted him with it, to which he was proud of it. So at that point, you know, I look at it like, so it's not a go or no go if they have the hazardous attitude. It's a go or no go if they're willing to fix it. So this person was so proud of their anti-authority. It was like, okay, we can't do anything here. There's nowhere to go. So in that case, you need to find somebody else.
Well, and honestly, I think part of the whole MPD like thing, they'll get very defensive about it. So you could present them, like I said, with the like logical information. You could tell them, hey man, you're acting very anti-authority here. They'll either, you know, there's usually one of like, you know, 3 or 4 responses they'll have, right? Like they'll be proud of it, they own it. Like Dan said, that's pretty terrible. They'll deny it and then get really defensive about it, or they're just not aware, and then maybe they have some sort of wake-up call. Like that's kind of the way I see the responses going. And 2 out of those 3, like they don't go well, because especially the defense one, you know, they get really defensive and then they turn it around on you and get, you know, they get, I don't want to say emotional, but they turn their defenses and lash out at you, because I've experienced that before.
The NPD clinically is quick to receive injury. So yeah.
Well, and I think you know, just speaking from my personal perspective, I mean, I think there are certainly moments in time where I could read any one of those 5 hazardous attitudes and be like, there are moments where I definitely experience.
Yeah, we all have tendencies.
Yeah, I think it's where am I open? I try to be open to feedback and grow from those experiences so that I don't sit in those areas.
And that right there says that you are not in PD. Like I've had moments in my life where I felt the same way. Like I literally called my friend one day and I was like, oh my God, am I being a narcissist about this? Like, am I just a closet narcissist and I didn't know it? And she said, Christy, the fact that you're even asking yourself that question means that you're not a narcissist. You know, they don't like recognize them, because narcissist is like an ugly word. You know, they're not going to sit there and admit that they're narcissistic. They're going to say that they're right, that they're this, that they're that, they're awesome and whatever else, but they're not going to ever admit, oh yeah, I'm a narcissist, because they're just not that humble, you know?
Yeah.
It's a very fun topic, isn't it? Psychology.
Well, I think where I get tripped up on is when you know a pilot in the community who, and I mean, I'm not even thinking of anybody in particular. It's just, you know, every once in a while you encounter somebody where you're like, wow, that person, they're definitely in that camp and they're a danger to themselves. And if something happens to them, and this is something that I preach, I guess, is when there's an incident, no matter what it is, it reflects poorly on the pilot community in general.
Yes.
And so there's a certain level of responsibility that I start looking at and going, could I have done more? Should I have done more? Because now I'm having to say, well, yeah, I mean, we all knew that he was whatever, or she was. And
yeah, I agree with you 100%. There is actually one incident in particular that it actually sits with me, dude. And I'll share it with you guys. We're all friends here. So number one, it's even worse when you thought you were friends with this person and then you realize later that they're MPD. and they were using you for their own personal gain. That's the first thing. Second of all, it's a terrible, terrible feeling when something happens and you're like, especially when you did try to say something and nobody would listen to. So that's the other thing too. That's the other piece of it. So there's one person in particular in our North Texas pilot community who I used to be very good friends with this person. And like, he was part of my circle, if you will. He helped me with instrument training. I mean, we were very close. He would come over to my house. I would cook for him. Like, we would hang out. He was part of our group. And I started seeing things in him. So I started speaking up. And this is back when I was married to Steve. So I would mention to Steve, hey, this guy, there's something going on with him, because there's clearly not something right, because I'm seeing this, and this. Like, I have like a few pretty awful examples, but I'll just leave it at, there were a few pretty awful examples. Hazardous attitudes, just up and down, right? And so it finally came to a head a little while later. He did something that was pretty unforgivable. And I said, you know what? No more. I'm out. And I would tell people, they would say, oh, I thought you so-and-so and you were friends. And I would tell them no, because he displays this, like, people knew that I did not care for this individual anymore because of these reasons, because of his, hazardous attitudes and things of that nature. Nobody would listen to me. Nobody would listen to me. So he wound up getting into two relationships with friends of mine, like, romantic relationships. He literally like tore down both of them. It was awful. I don't want to be like, oh, I tried to warn them, but I was very careful about condoning their relationship. And I would always just say, like, watch your back. And then he put one in financial ruin, and then the other one, he did something very atrocious. It's just a messed up situation. But what leads up to the airplane thing, he wound up with a brand new multi-engine student in a multi-engine airplane and had a gear up landing that could have resulted in a really, really, really bad situation. But it was his attitudes that actually led to that. It was the student's first multi-engine lesson. And he was doing the exact same things that he had done to me, berating her, telling her that if she was scared, she was going to be a good pilot. I mean, just all sorts of stuff. And he didn't notice that throughout all his beratement, she didn't put the gear down. And guess what? The gear horn was going off, but he didn't hear it through his own thick skull. And they wound up having a gear up landing, which not only damages his record, but hers as well. And it could have taken their lives. Had something even worse happened, I wouldn't have been surprised. But I refuse to fly with this individual anymore. And I mean, that's really all you can do, because I spoke up to people and it did nothing. And it, unfortunately, and I know this sucks to hear and it sucks to say, something really, really bad, like a life being taken, has to happen in order for people to open their eyes and be like, oh, like, I guess he was, or I guess she was X, Y, and Z. That is the unfortunate truth. So I've made peace with that as I have met other individuals in this industry with those attitudes. So I realized that I just have to, see and avoid, basically.
The last thing I would say about this is that the NPD person isn't, dressed with horns and a tail and a pitchfork. Okay. I mean, Hitler had fans, and a lot of them. The NPD person, while they think they're the smartest person in the world, oftentimes they are smart, and to a degree, maybe not as smart as they think. And they can sweet talk people. They can manipulate that. They're usually the NPD person. Again, I listed exploitative. That means manipulation. They're really good at it. And so, so be aware. It's not just somebody who, foams at the mouth. So anyway.
So switching back to the accident investigations. Other than John Denver, which accident investigation was either the most interesting or one that turned out in a way that you didn't expect it to?
All right, the Keith Green one. I don't know if anybody is aware that Keith Green was a Christian singer who died in 1982. He was kind of like one of the founding people of what's called Christian contemporary music or Christian rock. And that's what I grew up with in my life. And I will, to answer your question, Brian, you know, I did my initial video and I had people reach out to me who were instrumental players in the story, who were there. The whole reason why I talked to the only eyewitness is because people reached out to me saying you need to talk to him and everything else. And I will say that I left the video up there, but I've come to a completely different conclusion that I cannot publish, and I won't. So that one, to answer your question, I learned a whole bunch more after I did the video. I don't think my video is wrong, and that's why I've left it up. But I personally have come up with a different conclusion, and the conclusion does nobody any good. It doesn't make you a better person or a better pilot for the conclusion, so it'll stay with me.
Christy, did you have one?
Honestly, so okay, so the ones that we did on like Buddy Holly and Patsy Cline were I knew they weren't going to be as big. I thought the Patsy Cline story was really interesting. They didn't perform, neither of them performed as well, of course, as like John Denver or Keith Green, but that's because well, and I say that Buddy Holly, going back to the integrity of journalism and stuff, I wish I'd had more time. You know, normally with these stories, like there's no real deadline put on us. We basically create the deadlines. We can say, oh, we would like to release it around here, there. Like I knew for John Denver, I started working on John Denver months before the anniversary of John Denver's death. So we actually had it recorded, edited, and ready to go, like well before. Yeah, it was well before. With Buddy Holly, unfortunately, we decided to do something different. This was part of us experimenting. It was Dan, myself, and then when we had Bailey guest hosting with us on In the Hangar this last year, we were like, hey, wouldn't it be fun if we did that? So we basically put a deadline on ourselves. And I don't think we were able to get as much information as I personally would have liked in the story. And because of that, I think it suffered a little bit, but I would have loved to talk more about the hazardous attitudes that were impressed, you know, or that were kind of shown through in the story. It was really, because it is an interesting story. Like you want to know about Buddy Holly and the people that were, you know, killed in this crash, right? Everybody that was involved. But I wanted more information on the pilot.
Right.
I really wanted to highlight him and make him a key component of this, because obviously he's the one that, you know, drove the airplane into the ground, unfortunately. And he was a young dude displaying a lot of macho tendencies. You know, I can do it. I got this. And he also had the what was it? Invulnerability. Nothing's gonna happen.
No.
You know, and he was just a young dude hot rodding around in a Bonanza detail, you know. He had failed his instrument check ride. And that should have said something, right? But like, of course, like the people that were putting their lives in his hands, they didn't realize that. He did not have an instrument rating. So I would have liked to expand more on that story, and we might do a podcast on it. Dan, take notes. Because there's a lot. There's a lot
in the pilot. We've looked, and that's one with the older ones. Even on the Keith Green one, it took me a long time just to get anything from the NTSB because it's not online. You know, that even in 1982. Now we're going back into the late 50s. There's nothing. We couldn't find anything on the pilot.
I mean, know. I feel as though if we had more time, maybe we could have talked to people who knew or something, you know?
think if we had 2 years of a full-time job of trying to, we'd find nothing. I just don't think there's any, my opinion.
But yeah, so that one is kind of the flip side. That one didn't perform as well as I'd wanted it to, because I feel like there's a lot of really good lessons to be learned from that particular case. Everybody knows about it because, you know, people were so famous. It's just like Patsy Cline. Patsy Cline was another really good one too, that boiled down to hazardous attitudes, which is why Dan and I have been talking about this so much. You know, hers, what, like, she just trusted. I mean, literally, there were witnesses that overheard her tell the dude, hey, I trust you. If you say we can go, we can go. And the dude literally flew them up into the clouds with no instrument rating once again. And, you know, it was like violent storm conditions, and yeah, it killed everybody. And it's just, these are things that I think that I wish were more highlighted in the piloting community. And it's just not. Unfortunately, we see the sensationalism of it. And that's what really gets me, is that it's not always, it should be, these are the things that should be sensationalist. Like, we know the causes, we know what happened. Let's talk about how to prevent them. But it's the, you know, when you start throwing out words like, oh, it was suicide, or it was this, or it was that, that grabs people's attention, even though it's blatantly dishonest. And I think that needs to be highlighted more.
Do you guys have anything that you're working on right now for future releases that you're able to share?
Yeah, well, I mean, Christy and I just talked to each other the other day where we need to get another one out there. We all kind of have our pets. Jim Croce, I started researching. That's really interesting. The pilot ran 2.5 miles to get to the plane, and was all sweaty and tired. Also, Leonard Skinnard is one I've done research. So those are the two that are kind of on top of my list at the moment. Christy, what about you?
I've got a few. I have an Excel spreadsheet that I started like listing out.
Yeah.
Like I literally started listing out like, okay, this is interesting. This is interesting. I'm also, for me, obviously, I'm a 121 pilot, so I'm really interested in a lot of the 121 stuff. Because these are things that like, when we did Payne Stewart, that was really interesting. You know, that,
oh yeah.
So,
you know, I honestly, like, so usually what we do is we try to come up with like 2 or 3 things that we're going to record, and then I go to the studio, we record them on the same day, whether it's news, you know, the podcasts, these like accident reviews or whatever. Yeah, like things are getting really busy in the Schaefer household though. Kevin's going through line check airman training. I'm going through recurrent this month. I volunteer for several entities in the area. So I just got done with this Girls in Aviation Day event. My airplane goes down for annual, and then I'm getting ready for captain upgrade soon. So there's things that I'm kind of working on in between like all of this normal life stuff that I'm doing. And I did tell Dan, I was like, hey, I do need to get better. Like, I need to write a script for this story or that story. So it's definitely in the works. It's just, I need the time to do it.
So doing a YouTube channel is a lot of work, and people don't realize how much work goes into it. All right, I know we're going long, so.
Yeah, Mike, I was going to turn it back over to you.
Okay, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Christy. I really appreciate it. Very informative. I've written a lot of things down that I'm gonna take a look at with the black box reviews. I'm definitely gonna watch your one on John Denver and get some more into that. But that was good. And if anybody out there is looking for wings credit, just email me at flightsafety@coloradopilots.org with your name and your email address that you have on file with the FAA, and I'll make sure that you get wings credit for this webinar. Once again, everyone, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it. Dan, Christy, I wish you the best. I'll keep watching your channel.
Thank you.